Let's take an early look at the King Air E-90 crash. The King Air was en route from Columbus, Ohio to Parkersburg, West Virginia. The airplane was flown by two pilots, both of whom were multi-engine rated and instrument rated pilots. Everything appeared normal on takeoff, cruise, and on descent, they were again vectors to the RNAV Runway 21 approach at Mid-Ohio Airport. We heard them acknowledge clearance for the approach. They were asked to report the final approach fix. They reported the final approach fix inbound. And then shortly after that, acknowledged landing clearance by the tower. And then about 30 seconds later, we hear someone on the frequency asking if the King Air was okay.
Parkersburg Tower, King Air 515 Golf Kilo, with you on the RNAV 21.
King Air 515 Golf Kilo, Parkersburg Tower, report Midco.
Report Midco, 5 Golf Kilo.
King Air 5 Golf Kilo, how far from Midco are you?
We are 3 miles from Midco.
Okay, thank you.
5 Golf Kilo is Midco inbound.
King Air 5 Golf Kilo, let the contenders of vehicles on the runway checking for wildlife. They'll be clear shortly.
Roger.
King Air 5 Golf Kilo 1280 at 10, runway 21, clear to land.
Clear to land 21, 5 Golf Kilo.
Tower, did that plane just go down? I don't know. I saw the light. I may have got in a cloud. 5 Golf Kilo, you alright? King Air 515 Golf Kilo, Parkersburg.
Tower, we see smoke coming off the field back here, off the mountain.
Yeah, I'm on the phone.
We have video that shows what happened inside the final approach fix in terms of the final moments of the flight. You can see from the video that the airplane is out of control. The pilots have lost control of the airplane, and the airplane is in a pure vertical descent into a crash and explosion. So let's look at the potential issues in this accident that may have been a cause to the mishap. Some of the things the NTSB will investigate. We have a couple of clues, as we mentioned. So if we look at the conditions from yesterday, we can see based on the icing air met that came out, there were certainly icing conditions along the entire route of flight. The icing was forecast to be from the surface or near the surface up to about 12,000 feet. The King Air cruised en route at 11,000 feet and then started the descent, so they would have been in icing conditions the entire time. So there is the potential that icing built up on either the wings or the tail, and as the aircraft slowed, that's how the aircraft lost control and departed controlled flight. Another theory is the potential for an engine failure. There was some speculation that an engine or the aircraft was on fire as it crashed. Looking at the video and observations of, I have a lot of King Air time myself, and observations from other people who've flown King Airs, that doesn't appear to be a fire. It doesn't appear to be. What it appears to be to us, people that have flown a King Air, is a landing light that just appears bright because of the conditions of how we got the video. Now, King Air flies extremely well on single engine. With just two people, it would have been relatively light, even if it had full fuel. So a single engine failure in a King Air is normally a very manageable situation. Looking at the video, it appears as if we can see two exhaust plumes coming from the aircraft as it crashes. That seems to indicate that the engines were operating as the aircraft entered the ground in its final moments. But that's an interpretation of a very difficult video. A second potential issue here is a flight control problem or malfunction. The NTSB will look hard to see if the airplane was intact when it crashed. They'll survey the surrounding area and see if any kind of surfaces from the airplane, flight control surfaces or other, departed the airplane, which could have been a precipitating event to put the aircraft out of control. The NTSB will likely be able to determine that relatively quickly. A third potential is the potential for pilot error in terms of perhaps the pilots got too slow as they approached the final approach fix. Perhaps they got into some kind of a stall and then simply didn't have enough time to recover from the stall. From what we can see, the speed of the aircraft en route all the way down to inside the final approach fix looks normal. Inside the final approach fix, the speed rapidly plummets from about 130 knots or so down to less than 90 knots. And so that's an indication that somewhere in there that the pilot's lost control of the airplane. Another thing that we should look at in this incident is a crew rest as a factor for the crew. So looking at flight aware data, we can see that the time from the airplane landing the night before until it took off on this mishap accident, the difference was about 8 hours and 6 minutes or so. So that means if you account for time to taxi in and shut down and debrief, then put the airplane to bed, and then to wake up the next morning and get the airplane ready to fly, the crew was on, if it was the same crew, they were on a relatively short window and on short rest coming into the flight. Whether or not that played a factor in this flight is yet to be determined, but it's something for us to think about. So what are some lessons we general aviation pilots can take from this mishap, regardless of which direction the NTSB investigation goes? The first is icing conditions. We're entering winter conditions, so icing much more higher potential for us this time of year. So the first is to make sure we're doing good pre-flight look at our weather products to know whether or not icing is forecast or likely. If there's ever any icing forecast, it's a bad idea if you don't have icing equipment to fly into forecast icing. Avoid it. Secondly, if you find that you're in the icing conditions, try to get out of it as quickly as possible. So some ways you can get out is try to descend out of the icing if you're able, try to move horizontally based on the weather conditions, knowing in which direction the weather gets better is an option. And then if you find yourself in icing conditions as you're coming into land, a couple things to keep in mind is first, keep your speed up and don't use flaps. Most manufacturers recommend a no flap landing if there's icing involved and they don't have any kind of de-ice equipment. But if you have configured and you notice icing starting to build up, keep your speed up and keep configured just as you are. Don't change your configuration. We can also use this mishap to think about and remind ourselves about single engine procedures in twin aircraft, especially in IMC conditions. It's a demanding scenario, both on takeoff and on landing inside the final approach fix. We need to chair fly those procedures every time we fly, knowing exactly the steps we'll take if we were to lose an engine during those two critical phases of flight. It's a good idea to run through that procedure, especially if you have a co-pilot every time you fly, and then a part of your approach briefing on landing to talk about how you'll handle that if it happens on short final or inside the final approach fix. Thanks for watching. We'll keep you posted on what else we learn. Thank you for supporting AOPA.